Welcome back. Today we will continue with our lesson on pollination. In my last video we have studied about the parts of a flower. Let's do a quick revision. I have a picture on the parts of a flower. Now the stalk of the flower is called the pedicel. The base of the flower is the receptacle. The green leaf-like structures are called sepals, collectively calyx. These are the brightly colored petals, collectively called corolla. These are the stamens, the male reproductive part of the flower, collectively called androecium. This is the sepal, that is the female reproductive part of the flower, collectively called gynoecium. Now, the stamens are made up of two parts, the anther and the filament. The carpels are made up of three parts, the stigma, the style, and the ovary, which contains the ovules. Next, we go to androecium and gynoecium. It is these two parts of the flower that take part in pollination. Now we have a magnified picture of the gynoecium here and a magnified picture of the androecium here. You can clearly see the stigma, the style, and the ovary with the ovules. Here you can see the filament and the anther containing the pollen grains. Next, we move to pollination. What is pollination? Pollination is the process of transfer of pollen grains to the stigma. It is the transfer of pollen grains to the stigma. Now, pollination is of two types. We have self-pollination and cross-pollination. Now, in self-pollination, the pollen is transferred from the stamens or from the anther to the stigma of the same flower. Here, see, it is all taking place in the same flower. Pollen from the anther to the stigma of the same flower is self-pollination. Transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma of another flower is called cross-pollination. Remember, the species is the same. Again, cross-pollination is transfer of pollen to the stigma of another flower. Now, what is it that helps in the transfer of these pollen to the stigma? Now, there are agents of pollination that help in this transfer of pollen grains. Now, the agents of pollination are insects, wind, water, and animals. Now, insects include butterflies, bees, moths, beetles, and sometimes even ants. Now, how does this happen? Let's take each one. Now, in this case, this is pollination through insects. Take a look at this picture. You can see a bee visiting a flower. Now, why do these insects visit flowers? Insects visit flowers for a sugary liquid called nectar. Now, here the bee visits a flower to collect nectar. So, when the bee is having the nectar, the pollen grains, they get stuck to the body of the bee. Now, the bee with the pollen grain stuck to its body moves to another flower. Now, when the bee moves to another flower, the pollen that is stuck to the body of the bee gets deposited on the stigma of the other flower. And this is pollination through insects. Now, here I have the picture of a bee that is covered in pollen. Can you see this yellow powder on the bee, on the body of the bee? That is pollen. Now, what is the characteristic of these flowers that are visited by bees? Characteristics of insect pollinated flowers. The first one is the flowers are usually large and they are brightly colored. They also have a scent that attracts insects. Then these flowers also have nectar to attract the insects. Now the pollen grains on these flowers are large, they are sticky and they are heavy, usually with rough surfaces. Why a rough surface? So that they can get stuck to the body of the insect. Now the stamens in these flowers, insect pollinated flowers, are stiff. The stigmas are usually not feathery, they do not protrude, but they are sticky so that the pollen grains settling on them are not easily displaced. So the stigma is sticky so that the pollen grains that are stuck to the body of the insect can stick to the stigma. Now come to wind pollinated flowers. Can you see the picture? The pollen being blown away by the wind. Now what happens here? Wind pollinated plants release billions of pollen grains into the air so that a lucky few will hit their targets on other plants. Now these plants, they produce a lot of pollen so that at least some of the pollen can settle on the stigma of the female flower. Now some examples of wind pollinated flowers are rice, wheat, barley, oats. All grasses are pollinated by wind. Now what is the characteristic of these flowers that are pollinated by wind? Now the pollen grains of these flowers are very small and light. Why light? Because they have to be blown by the wind. They occur in very large numbers. The pollen grains are produced in very large numbers. Next, these flowers have petals that are green in color since they do not have to attract insects. The anthers of these flowers are exposed to the wind so that pollen can easily be blown away. What about the stigma? The stigma of these flowers is feathery so that it can catch the pollen that is blown by the wind. So it has feathery stigma and exposed anthers. What about petals? They are not brightly colored, they are green in color. Now here we have the characteristics of wind pollinated flowers and insect pollinated flowers. Now let's go to size and color of the petals. Flowers that are pollinated by wind are dull looking, they are small and less attractive. What about the stamens? Long stamens, and usually the stamens stick out of the petals. What about the anther? The anther is usually big and sticks loosely at the tip of the filament. Why does it stick loosely at the tip of the filament? Because it has to be blown by the wind. What is the appearance of the pollen? The pollen grains are tiny, they are smooth and they are light and large in numbers. The style is long and hairy or feathery. What about nectar? These flowers do not produce nectar. Examples of wind pollinated flowers are grass, then rice, maize and wheat. Next are insect pollinated flowers. The flowers are large, they are visible and they have a scent. Petals are brightly colored. The stamens are short, they are inside the petals. The anther is usually small and sticks firmly to the tip of the filament. What about the pollen? The pollen is big, the pollen is coarse, it is spiky, and the pollen grains are few in number compared to the wind-pollinated flowers. What about the style? The style is short and the stigma is sticky so that the pollen can get stuck to it. What about the nectar? Yes, these flowers produce nectar. Examples of insect-pollinated flowers are rose, hibiscus, orchids, and durian. Now we come to pollination in water. Aquatic plants are pollinated in water. Now how does that happen? Male flowers release a lot of pollen grains that drift in the water, where they come and get caught by the large feathery stigma of the female flowers. So what happens? Take a look at the picture. The stamens are here having anthers. Now the pollen grains, they float in the water, they drift till they come in contact with the stigma of the female flowers. We now come to the characteristic of these plants, aquatic plants. Flowers are very small, inconspicuous, meaning they are hardly visible, very small, not easily noticeable. Flower parts are unwettable. The flowers do not get wet. Flowers are nectarless and odorless. The flowers do not produce nectar, nor do they produce any scent. Pollen grains are light and unwettable. They are unwettable because they are covered by a gluey substance or a mucilaginous substance. There's an error in the spelling. It is mucilage. The stigma is long, sticky, and again does not get wet. Now, pollination by animals like birds and bats. Now you have the picture here. I have a picture of the hummingbird. Can you see it sucking nectar from the flower? Now these are birds that feed on nectar, and here is a bat that feeds on nectar. So these animals also help in pollination. When they visit the flower, the pollen grains get stuck to their body and are carried to another flower. So they also help in pollination. Well, children, I hope you have understood this chapter. Please read the lesson. Thank you.